But Bill, you laid out a comprehensive strategy which makes a lot of sense. And you touched on a lot of points. It is a complicated issue. And we have commitment at the highest levels of not just our government, but other governments as well. But it's a strategy that's going to take time to implement. And I guess the question would be, the situation on the ground right now is pretty bad in some cases. And so there may be a disconnect in terms of getting at the drug trafficking organizations and the gangs, which you identified at the top of your pyramid, who are causing trouble right now, as well as allowing the possible disconnect in terms of allowing that strategy to fully be implemented and take effect. And I guess the question would be, in the interim, who keeps the peace? And I'm referring specifically to a proposal that the outgoing president of Guatemala made about the idea of some sort of a regional security force or something like that. I'm not proposing that necessarily, but there are some ideas out there along those lines. I'd just like to get your reaction to who keeps the peace today in those circumstances.
Eric, fair point. And in fact, in the interest of time, I suppose I did not bore the audience by going through point by point, country by country, program by program, what we are already doing. But I do want to make it clear to you and to everyone else in the room that we're not starting at point zero. We do have programs. They're bilateral programs. The programs between the United States and El Salvador, the United States and Guatemala, the United States and Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Panama, and Belize. Those programs have not disappeared. They give us at least a starting point. So that the simplest answer to your question, what are we doing in essence while this larger initiative eventually takes form and begins to have an impact, we have a bilateral approach that continues, as does Spain, as does Colombia, which, by the way, is doing heroic service, in my opinion, in terms of assisting in the training of thousands of law enforcement personnel in Central America, as does Canada, as does the European Union. In other words, we are not, in essence, waiting before we get started. Now, President Colom has obviously has made some, I would call them more, he's thrown out some ideas for consideration, and that is how you develop, improve, fine-tune an approach. My own view and belief is what we will have to do. Our challenge, both within the 7 governments of Central America as well as the international community that chooses to support them, is to reach common agreement and understanding on the basic elements of the strategy. And I would suggest that we're pretty close to being there. That was what the SICA summit on the 23rd of June was all about. In about 2 weeks' time, most of the major donors, plus the SICA Executive Secretariat, will meet, and what we will do is try to take this strategy, this set of objectives, divide it up into more or less individual bite-sized chewable parts, and then in essence decide who is in the lead, who will have lead responsibility for this part, and how will we sequence it. If I might paraphrase the 16th President of the United States, you can do some things all the time and all things some of the time, but you can't do all things all the time. I know he didn't actually say that, but the concept is the same. And in a sense, that's what we have to address in this Central America initiative. Where do we start? Where do we put our initial focus? What is our thinking in terms of how this would sequence out over the next 1 to 5 years? And then who is in the lead? Which country, which element of which country? And in the lead means among the donors, but it also means within the Central American 7 as well. That's my suggestion as to where we are. If I can close with a baseball metaphor, don't hold me responsible for not yet having all details of a fully fleshed out plan. We are in the first inning of a 9-inning game. We hope it's only 9 innings and doesn't go into extra innings. And we are at this time still sorting out. We got our lineups more or less, but we're still sorting out how the flow of the game is going to proceed.
Very good, very good. Let's take one round of questions, see if we can get them all in. We'll take 3. I'm going to start way in the back, because every time I've been to one of these events, people start in the front. So let's start in the back with this young woman right here. Yes, we've got a microphone.
Thank you for calling me a young woman. That's great. Ambassador Brownfield, thank you very much. I have 3 questions. I'll try to make them brief.
Can
One
you
is
turn the
factual
microphone
one.
up, please, or is it on?
Hello?
Yeah,
Good.
that's much better. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Sarah Hagee from the Department of Commerce Western Hemisphere Division. I want to know if your strategy is this Partnership for Citizen Security. Is that the same thing as CARSI, the Central American Regional Security Initiative? I've heard a lot about that, and I know something about it. That's a factual question, but I've been working also, my second point is the Partnership for Growth is something in El Salvador that we've been working on quite a bit, and a lot of the economic competitiveness or economic growth initiatives that are part of that have a lot to do with security and crime. And while we do, my point is, and I hope you would comment on this, the need in government in the United States when we're coming up with a strategy for how to deal with Central America, specifically El Salvador here, could we get the greater cooperation or sharing of ideas between various groups that are always organized to address these challenges? And I mean the intelligence, your group at State and other organizations. I often feel that we address problems in different stovepipes. That's an internal USG question. And my third is...
Let's break it there because we need to get other
Yeah.
people into the conversation.
Okay.
Thank you for those. And there was a question right here, please, on the aisle. If we could, right here, this gentleman here on this side.
You're both on the aisle.
Yeah, that's true.
Richard Millett, St. Louis Committee on Foreign Relations. You mentioned very briefly the problems of the courts and the prosecutors. I think we need to look at that a little more closely. It's one thing to train police, but when the courts don't work, how do you expect the police to work? And when the public has no confidence in the courts, how do you expect them to work? And added to that, when the governments have a demonstrated inability to protect those who actually take a stand against the cartels or who try to dispense justice, how can you expect the courts to work? How do we deal with these kind of basic issues?
Thank you. And then since the gentleman here did stand up, and I did say on the aisle, let's go for the third question there, and then maybe we can take these all as a
I trapped you there, didn't I?
Thank you very
In a
much.
good way.
My concern is
Could you identify
domestic
yourself, please?
U.S.
Could you identify yourself, please?
I beg your pardon?
Could you identify yourself, please?
Oh, I'm William Stedman. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. U.S. domestic demand is certainly a considerable problem, which you've noted. I'd like to know what is being done, what can be done, and what coordination exists among various U.S. government, state, and local agencies to deal with domestic demand. Thank you.
Very good.
Got it. Eric, unusually, I will actually try to respond in the order in which the questions came forward. And I actually wrote them down, so I have a vague recollection of what was posed. First, CARSI versus the Central America Citizen Security Partnership. You are absolutely correct. There is complete interrelation, although the way I would differentiate is to say what the President was proposing in March of President Obama, in March of this year in San Salvador, was a collective multilateral international community effort. That was the Citizen Security Partnership. CARSI, if you will, would be the Central American Regional Security Initiative, would be the U.S. component from the security and law enforcement side. So my answer to your question is CASP, if that's what we will call the Citizen Security Partnership, is the large umbrella that covers the entire international community that is attempting to address these issues, and CARSI is the U.S. law enforcement, rule of law side and contribution to that effort. Now I need my glasses to see what I wrote. The Partnership for Growth. You are correct in noting there is some danger, I guess, in having proliferation of initiatives. And the Partnership for Growth, and I am fully aware that for much of this week, members of the Department of Commerce as well as the Department of State were, and I think in some cases still are, in El Salvador working this economic, business, commercial, trade, prosperity-driven agenda and initiative. And there is obvious overlap between that and a citizen security partnership. As a speaker so brilliantly articulated a few minutes ago, one of the core pillars has to be building strong and resilient communities. And to do that, there must be economic growth, there must be jobs, there must be business opportunities. Now, there has to be cross-communication between the two sets of people. There are now, always have been, and I suspect to some extent always will be, different communities and institutions between those responsible for law enforcement, rule of law, and citizen security on the one hand, and those responsible for economic development, economic growth, fiscal policy, budgetary policy, and business development on the other. But that does not mean that the two groups do not talk to one another, because if I might close this particular question with something that's so obvious it's almost a cliche, you're not going to have security if you don't have economic growth, and you ain't going to have economic growth if you don't have security. Duh. I think we have probably learned that lesson over the last, shall we say, 2,000 or 3,000 years. Next, a very valid point about the difference between training police, which is almost a numerical issue. How many police candidates can you run through a basic course or a more sophisticated course to get their skill level to the point where they can do their job well? And that actually is something we have become much better at, we, the international community, over the past 20 years. And part of the rule of law continuum, but separate therefrom, prosecutors and courts. We have learned, by the way, on that front, something we've also been working or attempting to learn from for the last 25 to 30 years, that in some ways, prosecutors and courts, which is a word I use to avoid saying judges, are more complicated in the sense that there is kind of a common global standard by which police are supposed to operate. Judicial systems and legal systems are inherently sovereign and inherently different. We, for example, have a common law system in the United States of America, except for Louisiana, and that has certain traditions in terms of how our laws, our courts, our prosecutions are done. Other countries of the world, including, I believe, 6 of the 7 governments and legal systems in Central America, have a code-based system. It's kind of difficult to get all to fit into one category. I will offer, by way of response, my own observation based upon, I guess I started doing this in El Salvador when I was a very, very young Foreign Service officer between 1981 and 1983. It is easier, actually, to work with prosecutors than it is to work with judges and courts. Because when you move into the judicial front, you are truly moving into a nation's absolute sovereign territory, where there's just an instinctive resistance to any other government or institution, not just the U.S., but any other one, coming in and, in essence, trying to tell them how to run their judicial system. Prosecutors are a little bit easier in that there are certain skills and talents that should, in essence, be applicable to a prosecutor anywhere. The process by which an individual attempts to convince an adjudication mechanism, call them a judge, call them a jury, call them Fred, I don't care what you call it, but that this individual, in fact, has committed this crime and should be sanctioned therefore. And we have learned over the last 30 years that there are certain common themes or threads that you can bring to bear upon prosecutors almost anywhere. You are correct, however, in your underlying assumption. If that element of the rule of law continuum is not also addressed, this initiative will not succeed.